Hello, everybody. We are starting chapter 23, Ecology, the branch of biology that deals with a study of living organisms, the relationship between living organisms and the abiotic or non-living part of the environment. The functional unit in ecology is an ecosystem. And an ecosystem, again, is a particular location, a group of organisms that are interacting on many different levels, and their interaction with the abiotic factors, the light, the water, the mixture of gases that we call air. Okay, some definitions I believe that I just covered. And now, in slide 3, we're looking at an ecosystem, an example of an ecosystem. There are terrestrial ecosystems, those involving land, and there are aquatic ecosystems, those involving water communities. So we're looking at an artist's illustration here of a little pond. I can tell it's a pond because there are rooted aquatic plants growing throughout the bottom here, and that means that light is penetrating to the bottom. So we have some microbial or microscopic organisms, phytoplankton, plant-like microbes that are able to carry out photosynthesis. Then there are some animal-like microscopic organisms that are called zooplankton that feed on the phytoplankton. Then we get into the macroscopic world where there are probably some little aquatic insects living in there that feed on the zooplankton, as well as some fish, herbivorous fish that eat the plants, carnivorous fish that eat other fish and some of those aquatic insects we just mentioned, and then we have some waterfowl up here, a duck that's probably feeding on the aquatic plants as well. So I've just described some members of the biotic community, the living things that are interacting. Then there's also the abiotic community. The most obvious here is the water. But also there is the air, the mixture of gases that comes in contact with the surface of the body of water. Very important because the carbon dioxide that is diffusing from the air into the body of water allows the plants to absorb that carbon dioxide, carry out photosynthesis, forming what we call a trophic level, the producers within that ecosystem. They are able to take that energy from the sun, convert it chemically, storing it in the bonds of glucose so that it's available to this community. In addition, the producers are giving off oxygen. There's oxygen diffusing in from the atmosphere, but they are also producing oxygen through photosynthesis, making it available to the heterotrophs, the carnivores, the herbivores, what we call the animals, and also these zooplankton living in this little ecosystem. So ecosystems are aquatic or terrestrial. They involve water, like lakes and ponds and streams and rivers and the ocean, or they involve land, terrestrial. What you're looking at here is a little collection of images from the major terrestrial ecosystems that we find on our planet. Another name for these large regional ecosystems is biomes. We live in the temperate deciduous biome, such as you would see in the upper left-hand corner here. You see a deer and some deciduous trees, those that drop their leaves in the wintertime when they become dormant. But there are a variety of other terrestrial ecosystems or biomes on the planet also, and the location of these is due to the amount of precipitation and temperature. So the interaction of temperature and precipitation is really what determines the dominant plant community, which is how we identify a biome. So again, we live in the temperate deciduous forest, which means that we have moderate temperatures, a moderate amount of precipitation, and the dominant plant community here would be all these beautiful deciduous trees that have just been turning colors and losing their leaves in the fall. But again, there are aquatic ecosystems. What all ecosystems have in common is they have a producer community, the plant community, and then a group of herbivores and carnivores. Um, we call those consumers or heterotrophs, those that feed off of the plant community. This is a map of the Earth's major biomes, and you can see that there is a bit of a latitudinal pattern here. Encircling the Arctic region, we have tundra, which is basically a cold desert, very little precipitation. Below that, we have a band, this dark green area, a band of coniferous forests. Another word for that is boreal forest or taiga. If any of you have ever driven up to Maine, you've seen the transition from the temperate deciduous forest in which we live to this coniferous forest where pines and spruces are dominating. Things aren't so clear once you get south of the boreal forest because, as you can see looking at the United States, we have a variety of different biomes here. We have a large land area here and many different climate patterns in terms of the amount of precipitation that these different areas get and the amount of sunlight. Mountain regions help to divide them up a little bit, so now we get into a variety of different biomes. But again, the major idea here is that the biome is named for or identified by the dominant plant community, and it is determined by the interaction of temperature and precipitation. This is a great graph. This shows you, again, how these different biomes are located based on the amount of precipitation and temperature. So we can see that if we have a very low amount of precipitation and fairly high temperatures, we have a desert. That's where those two interact. If you get a little bit more precipitation and a wider variation in temperature, you have a grassland. Grassland is also called a prairie. It's what we have out west. Grasslands are really important biomes because they have deep, fertile soil. And one of the important human interactions with grasslands is that we've converted a lot of them to agriculture. If you've ever driven out in the Midwest, going out into the western plains, you know that many of these this is the breadbasket of the United States. We've converted a lot of these to agriculture. So we can take a little closer look at some of these biomes, and you can see how the interaction of temperature and precipitation produces these different biomes. Again, we're looking at the temperate deciduous forest such as we live in, and you can see that this precipitation is distributed fairly evenly throughout the year, but we have very warm summers and pretty cold winters. These deciduous trees have adapted to go dormant in the winter when temperatures are too cold for photosynthesis by dropping their broad leaves, which would lose too much water in the wintertime if they were to stay on the trees. Here we have the taiga or boreal forest that we talked about before, such as you would experience up in Maine. Organisms that live in these different biomes have very specific adaptations for the particular abiotic factors that they're exposed to. So if you look at this one, again, the temperature is now not quite as warm as in the temperate deciduous forests, and they get in the summertime, and they get much colder in the wintertime. You can also see that the amount of precipitation, which is indicated by the blue line here, is much less. Now, you know what these trees are like. If you haven't been up to Maine, you may have a Christmas tree, and these are quite different from deciduous trees. They have to withstand cold temperatures, so their leaves are much reduced in size. They also have a waxy covering to keep them from desiccating or drying out in the wintertime. The dark green color allows maximum absorption of sunlight throughout the year. They don't drop these leaves, they maintain them so that they can carry out photosynthesis all year long. They have kind of flexible branches that won't break under heavy snow covers. So again, some interesting adaptations to the boreal environment. The tropical rainforest, interesting place, quite different from what we live in. Look at this climatograph that shows the temperatures and the precipitation. Heavy, heavy precipitation, pretty even all year long. And the temperatures are pretty even all year long. This is in the equatorial region, that part of the earth that is never pointed away from nor toward the sun. So we don't get the difference in daylight and evening that we have in the northern part of the world. Life spills over, very, very rich. And the desert. Most characteristic part of the desert is that it's dry. Look at the difference here. The blue line is down here just a little bit above zero. Whereas back in the, if we look back at that tropical rainforest, look at this, 300, close to 500 millimeters of rain throughout the year. Look back at the desert, much, much less. Dry conditions. Now, deserts actually can vary quite a bit. If we look up here in this top right photo, we're looking at what you would see in the Sahara, where it's very, very dry. Not enough moisture to support any kind of plant life. Then if you look in the lower left here, we have the desert that we have out in the southwestern United States called the Sonoran Desert. There's a little bit more precipitation, and so there can be plant life, and there is plant life. If you've ever been in the area around Tucson, the desert is beautiful. But these plants, these producers, have very interesting adaptations. Their leaves are reduced to spines that you wouldn't even recognize as leaves. Most of the photosynthesis takes place in this stem that's able to absorb water when it does rain. Animals, also interesting adaptations, many of them nocturnal. Some of them don't have to drink any water at all. And the tundra, very cold temperatures, and very low precipitation. So it's almost like a frozen grassland. The tundra would be in the area north of the boreal forest. The plants grow very low. There's not enough moisture to support trees. High winds and cold temperatures have caused them to create adaptations over time that include being very low to the ground so that they're not swept away by the wind. There's permafrost here, meaning perpetually frozen soil, only thaws out for a little bit of time in the summer. Very important in terms of what's happening right now with climate change, because that permafrost actually sequesters or holds on to a lot of carbon dioxide. Major concern about when the permafrost does thaw out. If a great deal of it thaws out, it's going to release a lot of that carbon dioxide, which will contribute even more to climate change. Now, here are the temperate grasslands. Again, the prairies that we have out in the western United States. And what's kind of interesting about this, if you look at this climatograph, it's quite different from the others in that you can see that there are a couple of dry seasons. Okay, temperatures get very cold in the wintertime. Not a whole lot of moisture all year long, so you can't really have a lot of tree growth. Instead, you have these perennial grasses which have developed that deep, rich soil that I mentioned earlier, which makes tremendous farming area. Just a quick look at one more. The temperate rainforest. This is pretty unusual, and we have one in the upper northwestern United States, Northern California, Oregon, and Washington. Plentiful rainfall all year long. Temperatures a little bit more moderate, and as a result, incredible life out there. Moisture loving animals. Have a look at a banana slug if you ever have the opportunity. So that was just a quick look at some of the biomes around the world. I just really want you to be aware of the fact that there are these different major ecosystems and that they result primarily from the interaction between particular temperature and precipitation conditions, and that organisms have evolved adaptations to those particular environments. Now let's take a look at some of the interactions between organisms that live in an ecosystem. The most obvious way that organisms interact in an ecosystem is by eating one another. Okay, who eats whom? And I'm sure you remember from when you were younger in school the concept of trophic levels or food webs and food chains. So this diagram shows an example of a food chain in an aquatic environment, and then on the other side an example of a terrestrial food chain. So let's start with this terrestrial food chain and ignore the aquatic for a minute. At the base of every food chain you have producers. So in this particular food chain, looks like we might be in a grassland, as a matter of fact, because at the base we have grasses. They are producers. Another name for a producer is autotroph. Self-autotroph feeding. Trophic level means feeding levels. So a food chain always starts with a producer. Again, somehow we have to get this radiant energy from the sun, and we have to convert it to chemical energy so that it's available to the rest of the biotic community, and only the producers are able to do that. We can't. So we are indebted to them. And then the next trophic level in this particular ecosystem would be an insect, an herbivorous insect. So this is the primary consumer level, also known as a heterotroph, called an herbivore because it eats a producer directly. What eats this grasshopper? Well, some kind of a rodent. In this case, it looks like a lined ground squirrel, and that makes him a secondary consumer, also a heterotroph. You would also call him a primary carnivore because he's eating another animal. In this particular ecosystem, we have one more level of consumer. All right, so we had primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers. In this case, it's a hawk, and a hawk would eat the rodent. Now, another very important consumer would be a decomposer. Decomposers would be fungi and bacteria. Slightly larger organisms that also feed off of dead things would be detritivores. Now we're talking about earthworms or roly-polies, millipedes. But you can see that they feed on all other levels within the ecosystem. And I want you to pay attention to these arrows as well, because these arrows, if you notice, all point in a particular direction. They are pointing in the direction of energy flow through the ecosystem. They start with what is being eaten, and they point in the direction of what is doing the eating. Notice that all of the arrows that go through the main part of the food chain here all point in the same direction. They don't go back in the other direction. And that is a very important concept. Energy flow is one way through an ecosystem. Starts with the sun, is converted by producers through the process of photosynthesis into chemical energy stored in the bonds of glucose, and then is transferred from one trophic level to another. We're going to talk about why that energy level is one way. Of course, that's not the only reason you eat. Organisms eat other organisms in order to obtain nutrients for growth and repair of tissue as well. So if you look quickly at the aquatic ecosystem example here, there's a counterpart to every level within the terrestrial ecosystem. The producers would be the phytoplankton, little microscopic algae or algae-like organisms. There would also be rooted aquatic plants like we saw in our little lake a little while ago. Then there are the microscopic animal-like organisms that eat those. These would be the primary consumers, the first level of consumption. We would also call them herbivores. Eating the herbivores are carnivores. They are secondary consumers, primary carnivores. And then finally, at the top of this particular food chain, you have a fish-eating bird. Again, just as in the terrestrial ecosystem, there are scavengers, detritivores, and decomposers that feed on the dead organisms from all of the other levels. So let's take a look at this again. I've written in red, very important concept. Energy flow is one way, whereas matter is recycled. So these arrows only represent energy flow. But we know that matter is recycled because if it weren't, we'd be up to our ears and then some in dead stuff. Nutrients are recycled through an ecosystem. When something dies or when it gives off waste products, the decomposers break those materials down finally into a molecular form that can be taken up by the producers again. So producers don't use just radiant energy, but they need to take in molecules. If you remember way back at the beginning of the semester when we talked about biological macromolecules, the lipids and the proteins and the carbohydrates and the nucleic acids and all of the different elements that were involved, primarily carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, all living things need those. And they are passed along from one trophic level to the next through eating, and they are recycled and they stay here. There's a finite supply of those on the planet. Energy, however, there's a constant flow of it from the sun, and there's a reason for that that we'll look at in just a minute. That energy cannot be recycled. The flow is one way. So the components of an ecosystem, again, there are abiotic components, the non-living environment, for example, the mixture of gases we call air, light, water, rocks and minerals, and the biotic components, the living components. We specify different kinds of biotic components by looking at where they are in the food chain. The autotrophs or self-feeders we also call producers, plants, things that can carry out photosynthesis. Heterotrophs, other feeders, these are the consumers. And they are broken down more specifically into the herbivores that eat the producers, the carnivores that eat other animals. Then, of course, there are omnivores that eat both plants and animals, and the detritus feeders, those that the detritivores and the decomposers. Interestingly, this omnivore, depending on what you're eating, when you're sitting down to eat a salad, you're an herbivore. When you sit down to eat a hamburger, you're a carnivore. So some organisms can occupy more than one level of the, or more than one trophic level. So let's look at a food web. We just looked at a food chain, and a food chain shows one particular pathway of energy through an ecosystem. In reality, there are generally many interacting food chains, and when we put all of those food chains together, we end up with a food web. So for example, when we look at this particular food web, we can see that there are, all right, well, let's start up here. Let's start with this oak tree. I know it's an oak tree because it's producing acorns. So there are lots of different things that eat the acorns. There are some birds that eat the acorns, and then there are hawks that eat those birds. So we've just described one food chain, one path of energy in this particular ecosystem. Oak tree, bird, larger carnivorous hawk. But also competing with that bird for the acorns are these little chipmunks. So another food chain in this food web would be from the acorn or the oak tree to the chipmunk, which can also be eaten by the hawk. Or it might be eaten at night by an owl. Or, poor thing, might also be eaten by a fox. So there are several different food chains here. Again, notice the arrows always go in the direction of energy flow from what is being eaten to what is doing the eating. Now, in this diagram, notice there are some new arrows. Now we're going to look at what happens to that energy. Why is it that nutrients can be recycled through an ecosystem and are recycled through an ecosystem, and yet energy flow must be constant? If the sun were blocked out tomorrow, we'd be in big trouble because this energy cannot be recycled. So let's start here with the sun. The solar energy is taken in by the producers, can be or is converted to chemical energy which can be passed on to the consumers. Now, the producers use some of that energy themselves. What is this energy used for? It's used for all of life processes. Back in the beginning of the year, we looked at characteristics of life. Living things reproduce. Living things need a source of energy in order to reproduce, to grow, to repair, to carry out all life processes. So some of that energy the producers use for themselves, some of it is left over and is passed on to the consumers, but notice that also some of it is lost as heat. All right? Now let's look at the consumers. Again, some of the energy that is taken in, they use for their life processes. Some of it will be left over to be passed on to the next trophic level. In this case, it's just a decomposer. And some of it is lost as heat. So, and I failed to mention here, but maybe you already picked up on the fact that the gray arrows are actually the nutrients which are recycled, whereas these orangish arrows represent the energy which is lost as heat. So at every level, that energy is lost as heat, and we can never get it back again. It's another way of saying that is that it's lost to entropy. So that energy is one way through the ecosystem being lost at every conversion. You know, the second law of thermodynamics tells us that energy, whenever energy is transferred, the transfer is never 100%. And in fact, only about 10% is transferred from one trophic level to the next. Again, the nutrients, however, are recycled. The decomposers break down the waste products and eventually the dead organisms themselves and reduce the molecules of which we are all made back down into particles that can be taken up again by the producers through their roots from the ground, along with water, used to produce, to grow and make more tissue and repair. All right, another diagram illustrating the same thing. Here we have this herbivore, and what is happening to the energy that this herbivore is getting from eating this shrub? Well, through cellular respiration, some of the molecules that it's getting, the nutrients it's getting from this plant are broken down, and the energy as those molecules are broken down is given off as heat to the environment. Some of the energy is used for growth and reproduction. Some of that energy that will be stored in the molecules that are left in that organism will be available to pass on to the carnivores. And the rest of it will go to the detritus feeders, the decomposers and the detritivores. This is why, if you remember, you've probably seen this before, this is why we use the shape of a pyramid to represent trophic levels within an ecosystem. Because if you think about a pyramid, what is it saying? The base is much larger than the apex. So let's look at this. We have the primary producers, the very large base here. That's where most of the energy is. Now let's look at this energy. In this case, the energy is expressed in units called kilocalories. So in this green producer trophic level, green to represent photosynthesis, there's 6,000 kilocalories available. Now let's look at the family of herbivores here that's eating these producers. Deer, birds, some rodents, some insects. Well, how much of the energy is actually passed on to them and how much is available after these producers use some of that energy that they transform from the sun for their own life processes? When they are eaten by the herbivores, only 600 kilocalories on average are passed on per square meter per year. That's per square meter of the Earth's surface. So what is the relationship between 600 and 6,000? Well, it's only 10% of 6,000. So 90% of the energy that was successfully converted by these producers is used and lost, again, at heat energy, lost in the transformation process. Only 600 kilocalories available to the herbivores. Then we have the secondary consumers, predators or carnivores that are eating the herbivores. How much is available to them? When they eat or feed on the herbivores, only 60 kilocalories per square meter per year is passed on. Again, approximately 10% of what was available in the herbivore level. Finally, the top level consumers get only 6 kilocalories of those 6,000 that were available originally in the producer level. This is why the shape of the pyramid represents so well what happens in terms of energy flow through an ecosystem. This is also why when you look out the window, what do you see primarily? You see primarily producers, and then you see a few consumers. You see more squirrels than you see coyotes or bears, and that is because so much energy is lost as it moves through the trophic level that you can't have very many top level consumers or carnivores. The energy flow just doesn't make it through to them. Now, that pyramid shape can also represent the amount of biomass or the number of organisms in an ecosystem. So the energy content is diminished as you go up a pyramid or from one trophic level to the next, but also is the amount of biomass. Biomass is simply the amount of matter in an organism. The numbers of organisms are reduced. Again, you see more producers than anything else. Then you see the next largest number of organisms you will likely see will be the herbivores, but very few top-level carnivores. So this pyramid can be useful in terms of expressing energy flowing through an ecosystem, the number of organisms in an ecosystem, and even the amount of biomass. Okay, another example of a food pyramid. In this case, we're looking at an aquatic environment. And in this case, instead of talking about energy in kilocalories, they're expressing the amount of grams or biomass at each trophic level. So, an ecological pyramid can represent energy, numbers, or biomass, and it does reflect the loss of energy from one trophic level to the next. And you will read about a 10% rule, which says that the average amount of energy that is passed on from one trophic level to the next is only about 10%. Now we're going to look at what happens more specifically to those nutrients. Biogeochemical cycles. We said that nutrients are cycled in an ecosystem. They are cycled between the living, hence the bio, and the non-living part of the earth, the mineral part of the earth and the soil, hence the geo. And this is why we call them biogeochemical cycles. We are going to look specifically here at 4 of them, 4 of the more important ones. The water cycle, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and the phosphorus cycle. And we're going to also look at how humans, with our various activities and development and so forth on the planet, how we impact these cycles, because it's pretty important. We have significant impact. Okay, I want you to remember as we're going through these, I want you to think back again to the beginning when we did our chemistry unit, the beginning of the semester, and we talked about the large macromolecules of which we are made. We talked about carbohydrates, which contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. We talked about lipids, which also contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. We talked about proteins, which contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but also nitrogen. We talked about nucleic acids, which contain carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And remember that also in our nucleic acids, there is a phosphate part of the molecule. Remember the sugar, phosphate backbone? So phosphorus is also important in terms of our nucleic acids. Another molecule you may remember that we mentioned briefly, adenosine triphosphate, ATP. This is an energy molecule. Every time, as you're carrying out cellular respiration and breaking down glucose to release that energy to carry out life processes, the energy is very temporarily stored in a bond called ATP, the P standing for phosphate again. So that's where phosphorus comes in. And all living things need these different nutrients, these different molecules. And so you're going to see how the bio part of these cycles, these biogeochemical cycles, how organisms interact and end up being a reservoir of these different raw materials. Okay, the water cycle. Again, because these things are cycles, you can pick them up anywhere. This one is probably pretty familiar to you, so we won't have to spend too much time here. But if we look at the water cycle, well, let's start in the ocean. We know that water molecules evaporate. They change from the liquid form to the gaseous form that we call water vapor after the ocean absorbs radiant energy. Okay? These water molecules absorb radiant energy, move faster and farther apart, and overcome atmospheric pressure, moving into the atmosphere in the form of water vapor. We call that evaporation. Evaporation also happens from the Earth's surface, though, not just from the ocean or other bodies of water. As those water molecules move up in the atmosphere, they lose heat energy, they move slower, they cool down, and they condense, moving back into the liquid phase. They condense out on little condensation nuclei, little particles, molecules, dust, and so forth in the atmosphere. We call that a cloud. When it becomes heavy enough, full enough, conditions are just right, those molecules fall back to the earth. That liquid water falls back to the earth as precipitation. Now, when it falls back to the earth, what happens to it? Well, some of it joins what we call runoff. There's surface runoff. This is what our rivers and streams do. They collect water from the Earth's surface and deliver it back into a larger body of water. Some of the water molecules penetrate the ground and join the groundwater flow, which also is flowing toward larger bodies of water. Now, some of the water that enters the ground is intercepted by plants that absorb it, use some of it for photosynthesis, and give off some of it through the leaves in a process that we call transpiration. So that is, in essence, the water cycle. Now, how do humans impact the water cycle? Well, in a lot of ways. We intercept groundwater and pump it out in wells and use it. We ship it off to different locations, all right? We might bottle it, take it out of the ground and bottle it and send it all over the planet. But another thing that we do is in our development, we create impervious surfaces. Look out the window right now, and depending on where you are, you see a lot of asphalt or concrete. Now, how does that impact it? Well, we just talked about the fact that in the water cycle, rain, precipitation that hits the ground, what happens to it? Well, some of it percolates down into the soil and replenishes the groundwater. But if we have a lot of asphalt and concrete and buildings, it can't do that. So that increases the runoff. That runoff then goes very quickly into nearby bodies of water, taking with it all kinds of pollutants, fertilizers, pesticides, and causing flooding. So we end up with flooding. We know this down on the coast of Connecticut because of the tremendous development, all of the impervious surfaces. We end up with a whole lot of flooding. So again, the water cycle. Water evaporates from bodies of water, lands and plants, returns when water falls on land to enter the ground, surface waters, or aquifers. human activities that interfere. We withdraw water from aquifers. Aquifer simply means a large underground storage area of water. It's not like an underground, tank of water. The water is actually between soil particles and in fractured bedrock. We clear vegetation from the land, build structures that prevent percolation, increasing runoff. So runoff is also increased not just by building impervious surface like concrete and asphalt, but also from clearing vegetation, because vegetation, the actual roots and stems, help to hold soil in place, and it intercepts, slows down that runoff. And we add pollutants. As we know, along the coast of Connecticut, all these major cities have wastewater treatment plants. So they take the wastewater, otherwise known as sewage, from homes and from businesses, and treat it, and then dump that water into Long Island Sound. And sometimes it's well treated, and other times it's inadequately treated, and this has significant impacts on Long Island Sound. Or when there's heavy rainfall, the wastewater treatment plants are overloaded, and the wastewater ends up going untreated or improperly treated into Long Island Sound. Whoops, I skipped the carbon cycle. We're going to backtrack here a little bit. The carbon cycle. Okay, living things contain carbon. We know that. It's in our, life is carbon based. Again, it's in our lipids, our carbohydrates, our proteins. When living things died millions of years ago in warm, shallow seas, decomposition was incomplete, and these leftover organic materials formed what we call coal and fossil fuels. Now, when we burn these fossil fuels, we are taking carbon that was sequestered or stored for millions of years underground as coal, natural gas, crude oil, and we return it to the atmosphere. Plants take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, carrying out photosynthesis. So they take that carbon and they fix it, fix meaning, put it into their structures here on the Earth's surface. We as consumers get our carbon for growth and repair by eating the plants or by eating other animals. We also give it back off into the atmosphere through cellular respiration. Okay, when you exhale, you're giving off carbon dioxide. Now, what is happening now, one way that humans are interfering with the carbon cycle, is that we are burning these fossil fuels, taking them out of the ground and burning them at a much faster rate than they can possibly be stored. And this is what's causing climate change, because carbon dioxide is one of what's called the greenhouse gases. It has the ability to absorb energy that has been absorbed from the sun, that has been absorbed by surfaces and re-radiated as heat energy and hold it in the atmosphere. So what we are doing is we are kind of upsetting the carbon cycle in that there was a balance between photosynthesis, taking in carbon, and respiration, giving it back off, and what we are doing is we are putting more carbon dioxide back into the air. Now, the oceans absorb carbon dioxide through the process of diffusion, and they have been actually absorbing a lot of this excess carbon dioxide that we have been putting back into the atmosphere. As a result, they are becoming acidified, and they can only absorb so much. This large area of the planet that is water, that is in direct contact with the atmosphere, allows this diffusion of excess carbon dioxide. But this acidification, when water absorbs carbon dioxide, it essentially produces carbonic acid. and that interferes with the organisms that are living in the ocean that are able to, that produce shells. You know, a lot of shelled organisms, mollusks, bivalves like oysters and clams, um, or other organisms that have skeletons. They produce those from the carbon dioxide in the water, but they're not able to do that or coral reefs as well. They're not able to do that when the ocean becomes too acidified. So we are, you know, this is another problem with the excessive carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So the carbon cycle. Again, carbon dioxide is exchanged between the atmosphere and living things. Plants incorporate carbon dioxide into nutrients through photosynthesis, providing or making this carbon available to themselves, but also for heterotrophs like us. Carbon dioxide is returned to the atmosphere through respiration, but it is also returned to the atmosphere through the burning of fossil fuels. This is what's causing climate change. Carbon dioxide, other gases, we'll be talking about nitrous oxide in a little bit, and methane are other ways that we add greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. Now, not only the burning of carbon dioxide, of carbon-based fuels, but also deforestation. We're increasing climate change by cutting down trees, which are major sequesters of carbon, especially the rainforest. Okay, so we are increasing this carbon dioxide in the atmosphere through burning of fossil fuels as well as deforestation. This map is, and we'll talk more about this in the next chapter, but this map of the United States is showing us what is predicted in terms of temperature change right here in the United States per century based on the emission of greenhouse gases. And of course, the poor polar bear is one of the greatest victims. The polar bear is threatened by climate change. It's a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act. And what is happening is that because of the melting of polar ice, it is finding it very difficult to hunt. Has to swim long distances in order to hunt the food that it eats. And these poor things end up being, you know, actually dying, drowning, because they have to go too far out from the land in order to try to hunt. All right, let's take a look at the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen, again, an important component of proteins, nucleic acids, and ATP, as well as some other molecules in your body. So all living things need nitrogen. Plants need nitrogen for the same molecules that we need them for, but they also need nitrogen in order to produce chlorophyll, the molecule that is critical for photosynthesis. Interestingly, nitrogen, is a major portion of the atmosphere. 78% of the atmosphere is nitrogen gas, but it is in the form of elemental nitrogen, N2. Plants can't take up N2. They can take up nitrates, NO3, and they can take up ammonium, NH4, but they can't take nitrogen out of the atmosphere, neither can we. So they are dependent upon nitrogen-fixing bacteria, little bacteria in the water and in the soil that are actually able to fix nitrogen. And fix, again, means convert it into a molecule that is available to plants. So these nitrogen-fixing bacteria convert this nitrogen into ammonium that plants can use. Other bacteria in the soil called nitrifying bacteria can take that ammonium and convert it to nitrate that plants can also use. Now still another group of bacteria, these are actually anaerobic bacteria, meaning they don't use oxygen, can denitrify nitrates and nitrites, and that means turn it back into nitrogen gas that is emitted back into the atmosphere. So let's have a look at this. This is a pretty complex cycle. Okay, again, there are nitrogen fixing bacteria that can take N2 gas, convert it into ammonium, which is converted by other nitrifying bacteria into nitrates available to plants, or which can be taken by denitrifying bacteria and returned to the atmosphere. Kind of interesting that also another way of fixing some nitrogen is through lightning. Okay, that can provide some energy for fixing nitrogen. So how have humans interfered with this? Well, you can see we're driving our cars, and these internal combustion engines, very hot, high temperatures, you know that, if you've ever made the mistake of touching a hot tailpipe. Actually coming in contact with nitrogen in the atmosphere form nitrogen oxides. These nitrogen oxides, one of the things that the emissions testing, when you take your car through, they test for these nitrogen oxides. These act as greenhouse gases. They also can produce acid rain. So when these nitrogen oxides are dissolved by water falling through the atmosphere, they form nitric acid, which causes acid rain that impacts especially aquatic life. The other thing that we do is our fertilizers. Okay, we interfere because we have learned how, actually as of World War II, we learned how to circumvent these nitrogen fixing bacteria and artificially take nitrogen out of the atmosphere to produce fertilizer. Now this artificial fertilizer we use tremendously. Okay, again, remember we said nitrogen is important for chlorophyll. So you dump it all over your lawns to make nice green lawns. We use it excessively in our agriculture. And we use too much of it. And as a result, we use more than the plants can even absorb. What happens? It joins the surface runoff and it ends up in bodies of water. Now, fertilizer will cause algal growth or feed algal growth just as it will your lawn or your garden or the monoculture of corn out in the Midwest. So algae will proliferate. We call these algae blooms. Okay, they absorb this nitrogen runoff as well as wastewater runoff that also has nitrogen in it, causing algal blooms. When the algae die, they are broken down by decomposers. And the decomposers, just like you and I, use oxygen for cellular respiration. So when they are breaking down this tremendous algal bloom, they use up all the oxygen in the water, and this gives rise to something called hypoxia, low oxygen, which means that there's not enough oxygen available for the fish and other aquatic organisms. And this is having a major impact in Long Island Sound. In the Gulf of Mexico, this hypoxia creates what's called a dead zone. So, major impact. This is how, when we interfere with the nitrogen cycle by our use of fertilizers that we create artificially and use excessively so that they run off into bodies of water, we are wreaking havoc really in nearby bodies of water. Have a look sometime, look up Long Island Sound dead zone, and you will see that every summer there are fish kills, and Long Island Sound goes hypoxic, too little oxygen because of this problem with excessive nitrogen from both improperly treated wastewater and excessive fertilizer use. Okay, so again, the nitrogen cycle, human activities that interfere, nitrogen fertilizers that run off into lakes and streams end up in larger bodies of water like Long Island Sound, causing fish kills due to hypoxia, which is a result of this eutrophication process, which means nutrient enrichment. Also, burning of fossil fuels puts nitrogen oxides as well as sulfur oxides into the atmosphere, creating acid rain, as well as smog in some parts of the world, especially out in the western area, Los Angeles, for example. Thermal inversions. If we look at the left-hand diagram here, this is a normal pattern. Normally, our atmosphere is heated as radiant energy is absorbed by the Earth's surface and then re-radiated as heat energy or infrared. which then makes the atmosphere right near the Earth's surface warm, meaning the molecules are farther apart and the air is less dense. And it rises up into the atmosphere, cooling as it goes and taking this heat energy with it. However, in some areas like Los Angeles, which are surrounded by mountainous regions, and they tend to be very warm and have strong sunlight, what can happen is a colder mass of air can come in and get trapped in this area. Again, normally there would be a warm air layer below a cooler area, which will allow this air mass to rise up, mix, getting rid of the pollutants that are formed in the city. But when a cool air mass slides in underneath this warmer air mass and is trapped by the mountains surrounding it, what happens is you can get very serious pollution problems. We call these inversion layers, and you hear about them, especially in the summertime in areas around Los Angeles. So here we have again this nitrogen cycle. We give off excessive nitrogen by our burning of fossil fuels, by our tremendous number of cars, creates acid rain that will destroy anything made out of limestone or marble, and also kill off plants. They can only tolerate so much acidity. Finally, let's look at the phosphorus cycle. Remember, we said that phosphorus is used by living things in the form of phosphate. That is when it's combined with oxygen in a PO4 molecule. You have it in your nucleic acids as well as ATP. Now, this is kind of interesting because unlike the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle, there's not really a gaseous phase. That means that phosphate is generally found in the soil and tied up in rock. What do? Well, we mine it. We mine it and bring it up out of the rock, put it into fertilizer, and again, just like nitrogen, we use it, excessive fertilizer. It ends up in the surface runoff, and it is an important limiting factor in terms of plant growth, just like nitrogen is. When you buy fertilizer, look at your bag of fertilizer, whether it's Miracle Grow for house plants or something that you're using outside. You're going to see that the main nutrients are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Now, phosphorus is a primary limiting factor, meaning it limits plant growth when it's in too small a supply. That's not usually the problem when we're using fertilizers. It's an excessive supply. And it runs off into a body of water and will cause eutrophication, nutrient enrichment, just as nitrogen will. Turns out that phosphorus is a primary limiting factor in freshwater bodies like lakes and ponds, whereas nitrogen is the primary limiting factor in a saltwater body like the Atlantic Ocean or Long Island Sound. So, human activities interfering, runoff of phosphates from fertilizers and improperly treated sewage. And we generally do distinguish between point and non-point sources of pollution. When you see a water pipe dumping into a body of water, or a pipe coming out of the top, into the air, giving off smoke and so forth, that air pollution, that's a point source. You can point right at it and say that is the source of pollution. But more insidious sources of pollution will be non-point sources, where you can't exactly tell, where is this pollution coming from, because it's more diffuse. It's coming from all of the lawns using fertilizer, for example, along Long Island Sound. Now, lastly, I want to talk about something that is known as bioaccumulation and biomagnification. Some substances bioaccumulate. That is, they build up in an organism's tissue. Typically, it's in fatty tissue. And these are usually materials that living organisms are not designed or have not evolved to break down. So they accumulate in our tissue and then they biomagnify or become more concentrated up the food chain. And your assignment this week has to do with the bioaccumulation and biomagnification of mercury. And some of you, before even looking at the assignment this week, may have been familiar with the fact that you shouldn't eat too many high level, meaning high trophic level fish like salmon and tuna. And that's because of this problem with bioaccumulation and biomagnification of mercury. Now, how does mercury, which is a heavy toxic metal that can cause nervous system disorders, in fact, you may have heard of the fact that Danbury, Hat City, used to have a large hatting industry, and they used mercury in the curing of these felt hats that they made. As a result, many people ended up having serious nervous system disorders. And from this, Lewis Carroll actually, when he created his character called the Mad Hatter, he was referring to this. The Mad Hatter is crazy, and that's because of all the mercury used in the hatting industry. At any rate, how does this mercury get out there? Well, it was one thing when it was used in the hatting industry, but now it is primarily due to the burning of coal. Coal has a lot of mercury in it, and when coal is burned, this mercury is released into the atmosphere, then falls back down to the earth in rain. It's picked up by rain, ends up in bodies of water where it's taken up by the plants, which are eaten, or algae, which are eaten by the zooplankton, which are eaten by larger fish, and then even larger are carnivorous fish, and finally, well, they can be eaten by fish-eating birds or fish-eating mammals like otters or like human beings. Because mercury is not metabolized and gotten rid of by the body through normal excretion, remember we talked about kidneys, they remove toxins from our blood. Well, that's not the case with mercury. It builds up in our fatty tissue. And so algae or lower level producers will have low concentrations, but every time other organisms, consumers, eat them, they build it up in their fatty tissue, so that by the time you get to high level carnivores or high level, organisms higher on the trophic level, they've built up pretty high levels of this mercury in their system to toxic levels. And this is called biomagnification. So the bioaccumulation refers to the fact that it builds up primarily in fatty tissue. Biomagnification means that the concentrations are built up through the food chain. So if we look at this pyramid, well, we've just talked about a pyramid, right, that represents the different trophic levels. We know that energy dissipates or is lost as you move up. The biomass is reduced through the food chain. The numbers of organisms reduce through the food chain, but it's just the opposite with things like mercury, or in this case, this is representing DDT, that instead of being dissipated, just the opposite. The concentrations are magnified as you move up through the food chain to very toxic levels. And you're going to study this in your assignment this week, and hopefully some of you will look up DDT and what happens with that, and how that got into the food chains, and what were some of the devastating repercussions in the environment. So that wraps it up for chapter 23, and I hope that my being able to narrate this a little bit might have made the PowerPoints even a little bit clearer to you. See you online.